Nursery and reception story. Oh, George was so proud when he would go out and walk his dogs in all of the fine countryside right there, right in the middle of London. But what made him proudest of all was when his wife gave him a little baby daughter. She was called Elizabeth. They would stand and they would look towards each other, and they would be so happy to think that they were now 1, 2, 3. 3 of them all together. And he would smile and he would look. Now, some people said that the royal family would last forever, just as long as the dinosaurs. And they would have to go far and wide and travel from the top of the world to the bottom of the world, from around the world and back. And they would go and visit places. And in the meantime, Elizabeth would be looked after by her nanny, a lady called Crofty. And she was kind and gentle, and they too would go and walk the dogs out in the countryside in the middle of London. Father George would come back, and he would tell his little baby daughter all about the things he'd seen in Africa, of great crocodiles down by the side of the River Nile. And then, when their mother had another little baby girl called Margaret, George would smile and he would say, "Now we are 1, 2, 3, 4. Second nursery story. On the day that the Queen was crowned, she had to sit for such a long time. She had to sit on a throne, everybody's back straight. She had to wear the finest of gowns, put some good clothes on. She had a crown on her head, everybody put a crown on your head. She had a sceptre in her arms and a globe by her side, an orb, and it was all very heavy. She looked, and then she tried not to smile too much, because she was thinking that night she was going to go on a train journey. She was going to go away from London. She was going to go, and everybody do this with me. She was going to go, can you do this with me? All around the world. Can you do that with me? And say it with me. All around the world. Because she was the Queen now. Not just of England. Not just of Great Britain. She was the Queen of lots of places. She would have to go, fingers like this, all around the world. She would go to Canada and Australia and Africa and all of these different countries and India. And one day she turned around and she looked. And you know something? She wasn't a young lady anymore. She was the Queen who'd been the Queen for 25 years. Can you all say that with me? 25 years. Everybody was very happy. Everybody show me your best happy faces like this. Everybody, when they saw her, they all shouted, "Hooray!" And she had to go from the top of Britain to the bottom of the Britain. And everywhere she went, she had to eat some cake. Some days she would sit herself down and go, "Oh, please. Oh, please." Can you all say that with me? "Oh, please. I don't want to eat any more cakes." And she travelled around. And when her own children had their own children, so that she had grandchildren, she would say to them, "What would you like to do today?" What did she say? "What would you like to do today?" And every time the children would look, and the children would say, "Oh, grandmama." Can you say that with me? Put your hands like this. "Oh, grandmama, please, can we cut out some cakes?" "Oh, no," said the Queen. Can you do that with me? "Oh, no," said the Queen. "Not more cakes." But she didn't mind when the children would cut out cakes. Can you cut some cakes out with me? When they would cut out cakes, they would give us some. They were white on the top, with reds and greens and yellows and blues. And she forgot all about the fact that she didn't really like cake anymore. Everybody, grab hold of a cake. Get a cake in your hand. You ready? She'd sniff it. It did smell sweet. It looked so beautiful. Are you ready? Great big bite. And she would say to her grandchildren, "Oh, thank you very much. I really love cakes." Year 1, Year 2 story, starting with when. There was a rainbow in the sky on the spring morning. The mother was happy and proud as she took the photograph of her 2 young daughters. She loved the way that Elizabeth wrapped her arms around Margaret and took a photograph of them by the side of the splintered church door, a wooden door, a door that she'd been to herself when she was younger. They'd all come here as part of the family to see this christening of a little cousin for these 2 girls, yet another little girl. As she looked about her, the mother thought, "I'm going to take that photograph. I'm going to make sure that they get to see this photograph of how they were," and she put it inside of a photograph album. They loved to look at it, to remember what it was like before their father became the king. He wasn't meant to be the king. He wasn't supposed to be the king. But the king, who was there, Edward, decided that he did not want to be the king. Now, many years later, with a golden orb in her hands, as she stood there, everyone was taking photographs of her. She was the queen. And she remembered being with her sister, standing by the door, at that time, smiling, hugging Margaret. Oh, this golden orb weighed so much in her hands. And it was remembering of what it was like when she was younger that made her smile. Years later, the Queen, to celebrate 50 years of being the Queen, she had to go on a boat on a river. And even as the rain came down, and she felt so cold, and her husband Philip looked about and did not feel so very well, she smiled. Everybody show me. She smiled and looked and remembered a time when there was a rainbow in the sky on a spring morning, as the 2 of them stood by the door of a church and had their photograph taken by their mother. It was in 1967, the time that I was very close to the Queen. She didn't come over to me, she didn't shake my hand, she didn't look me in the eye, but it was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to me, because I used to be in the Boy Scouts. And in the Boy Scouts, a bit like this picture you'll see here, where you've got Elizabeth in her Sea Scout uniform, I had to wear a uniform. I had shorts and a khaki shirt, and had all the badges that I'd sort of like earned. And it was for the opening of the Tyne Tunnel. So there I was, and we were asked to go and stand by the front of the Tyne Tunnel where the cars go down. And we had to stand by that bit just before the tunnel goes down under the ground and under the river. And we were asked to stand there, and we had to go at about 8 o'clock in the morning. We were standing there, and the Queen was going to arrive about, I think it was about 11 o'clock or thereabouts. Everybody was very excited. We all had to stand in rows. We all had to do our Cub Scout salute, our Scout salute. We all had to do this and stand there and wait. And I couldn't believe it, that the car, we didn't know where she was going to stop, but the car drove very, very slowly down and stopped about as far away as your teacher over here with the red jumper on is, and the Queen got out. And I can remember to this day, my heart was beating. This is the first time I'd ever seen her. At that time we didn't have a television set, so I couldn't believe it. I'd only seen photographs of her or seen her at the cinema, and there she was standing there. The Queen was really there. My heart was beating. She had a round hat on, I still remember it, a round hat on, and on the top it looked like a pom-pom, but like half a pom-pom, a round thing at the top. And she was wearing a coat just like my mum would wear, because my mum was born the same year as the Queen. And she stood there and she had a handbag, and she just looked. I was expecting her to come out of the car looking like this, with a crown on her head and robes by her side and a sceptre in her hand and a great orb by her side. And in her hand she had a handbag. But everybody was really pleased. We all did our salute. She opened up the Tyne Tunnel. And I've got to tell you, from that time, every time that I drive through, I remember the time that I stood by the side of the mouth of the Tyne Tunnel on the south side and saw the Queen. Year 3-4 story, starting with what? He knew that the king had seen the newspaper photographs that he had taken of the princesses that were now on this day, on his coronation day, and that was what had made him choose him. The king had said he was the best of the best. I like the way that you took photographs of me and my family. But here he was standing. He'd never been inside of the gates, never mind inside of the heart of Buckingham Palace. This was a very important place, but it was hot. It was hot, and he wore his smart suit jacket. He was an old man. He'd been taking photographs ever since photographs had started. He loved it. He was joyful that we now had a new king, a new queen, and 2 beautiful princesses. On a cold, wet afternoon, after all of the ceremonies, they all stood there. He could see the sceptre in the king's hand. He could see the king. He knew that the girls had been standing all day. He was hoping that he'd be able to get a smile from them. A smile from these 2 young girls who were now Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. He did everything he could. He smiled, he juggled, he danced. He kicked his walking stick up in the air and rolled it around. And still they stood there. Not a smile upon their lips or their faces. And then he took off his jacket. Everybody about them gasped. How could he do that in front of the king and queen? He couldn't stop himself. He was too hot. He was an old man. He wanted to have a photograph that looked like a family. The king had always said, now we are 4. Himself, his wife, and their 2 little daughters. When the king started to look so angry, he looked at them. Do you think that's funny, my daughters? The princesses couldn't stop themselves. They started to fidget. They started to giggle. And it was then that he clicked that photograph and it was taken. The princesses, not back straight, not downturned faces, smiles on all of their lips. And as a reward, the king gave him something that he never thought he would ever see. Even though he was an old man, he gave him something that from that time, whenever he made a photograph, he could put at the corner, photographer to the king, the queen, and the 2 smiling princesses. And he would do it. On every single photograph that he ever took, he would take it and click it upon the back. Photographer to the royal family. Year 5, year 6, starting with who? This old man had been here before, inside of Buckingham Palace, inside of the throne room. For some it was special, but for him it was like being in the middle of a cathedral. He couldn't believe it. A wise man, an old man, a man who was not frightened of eating. It took him a long time to do anything, and here he was, old and stocky, but it had taken hours to get the throne room cleaned. He looked. The maids had all scurried about, but now the princesses were even starting to become bored. They were fidgeting. They could see things on the ground that the maids hadn't seen. And when a maid came down by the side of the throne room, sweeping the floor, the 2 princesses broke away from where they should have been standing and helped that maid. Oh, their father, the king, was not pleased. He'd had to stand there with them for hours while this old man got this photograph so completely right. And then they could hear in the distance the bells of Big Ben striking 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That meant that they'd been here nearly 3 hours standing for one photograph. And as they looked about them, the princesses could see one of the maids. She was creeping down by the side, creeping down carefully, slowly, just like a cat, down by the side of the throne room. The princesses started to look. The princesses started to nudge each other as their eyes wandered away from this portrait and looked towards this maid. They started to giggle. They started to shake. And one of the crowns on Margaret's head started to move slightly to one side. Well, Princess Elizabeth couldn't stop her laughter. And now the 2 of them, the king, furious, grinding his teeth as he looked at them. His anger inside of his heart bursting through his veins, he looked at these 2 and hissed under his breath, "Will you 2 be still and quiet?" Well, him telling them to be still and quiet just made them laugh the more. Princess Elizabeth shook. She shook so much that the old photographer could see this crown starting to roll, starting to come down by the side of her beautiful dress. It was starting to roll further and further away. The maid's hand reached towards it just as the old man got there. If the king had been furious before, he stamped his feet. "You girl, you are a maid. You should not be in this throne room other than to clean it." The old man had seen kings and queens and knew that sometimes their anger could be stronger than their kindness. "Oh, I don't think the girl meant any harm," said the old man. The king turned to him. "I don't think that the girl meant any harm. She was just trying to help, to make sure that this was the best portrait in all of this world." The girl placed that crown on top of Princess Elizabeth's head. She helped her to walk back, placed herself on the second step beside her father and mother, and under her breath, she whispered, "I'm sorry, Father." And as she said sorry, it was then that the photograph was taken. She was looking straight at the camera, saying sorry, a smile upon her lips, a smile like a cat, like that maid who had brought the crown and placed it back on top of her head. And it was only the royal family and the photographer who ever knew the true story of that portrait, of what had happened just before the portrait was taken. Oh, sorry, I forgot. There was a maid with a smile who could tell her children and her grandchildren how she'd held the crown of a future queen.